So Samira and I had an exchange of a dialogue using email and exchanged a few ideas. And it was Samira indeed who in some of the kind of ideas that she was kind of talked about or said something like from wish to with.
We're looking at that being with as a coming together, and looking at what the requirements that underpin this coming together, but also the possibilities that unleashes. And there's details about individual possibilities and individual requirements and what that can lead to maybe as a possible mode of resistance.
I also think that we all came up with this understanding of with being like focused on the group and the aim of the group and how we can all together grow and move, except like focus on your own.
What does it mean to be with, to hold that space? Is it solidarity? Is it care? Is it generosity?
It takes more work to be with rather than alongside. It's deeper work. How might we preserve the aspirational nature of the wish, keep it in there as we move to working with?
It starts with a dreamy intention to spend time with special people, unknown possibilities, and from there moving to the things you will concretely do.
Being with as a coming together, recognizing and unleashing the possibilities of being with.
If you don't mind rereading the phrase, and in the meantime, Michaela will be, or Maze, will be starting to send you into the breakout rooms where you talk and write, and then we'll always give you signals as to when you can start tidying up a little bit or preparing to return to the main room. And slowly, I think it will lead to more of a sharing.
To navigate between different identities, to find the common identity within it, and to find, in the end, your voice.
I'm struck by the between place is a messy place. I think this really resonates for me because it's what I experience that space in between to be, particularly in the art world or in collaborative space, and keeping it open and messy, I think is a huge part of the work and the labor, the emotional labor of that.
It is complex, and actually it's a system which has almost an exponential amount of possibilities in it from the numbers of participants and our experiences and thoughts. So its complexity is that it's potentially a weak, what you might call a weak process, where it's not necessarily containable, controllable, or anything. It's actually comes out of human interaction. So it's a kind of what we're talking about is a kind of a weak process between where we allow the space for imagination to form.
Between space is a messy space because we thought our cases as collectives, and that this messiness is part of the evolution of the collective itself. So we need to deal with this, and we need to perceive this maybe not as something negative, but something that happens physically in collectives.
Every statement has this idea of the in-betweenness being a space of its own and not a space that you can or a situation that you can not overcome as quickly as possible, but a room or a space where you stay in collaboration.
To navigate between different identities, to find the common identity within this setting, and to find your voice.
Between is a space of becoming, of letting go and taking in, being in constant motion, never fully arriving.
The space that we have in common is what connects us. This in-between, even if our identities and histories and cultures are different.
The space in between is the connector. The between space is about diversity, language, and is a third space of collaboration while maintaining our difference.
Working around whether it's geometry or space or horizon. It's also about listening. It's about hearing voices, situations, experiences, places that might be previously marginalized. So it keeps things open.
To retain an ability to respond, without being determined somehow by previous decisions. So that seems an interesting tension.
So I started to think about what this would mean in terms of a community. I think the better word is neighborhood, because often the common phrase is you live around here.
Perhaps one more comment?
For me, it's interesting how we've conceived of the around as a space and how we move away from the center maybe of what something surrounds or is around, and the willingness of someone how far someone is willing to move away from the familiar outwards, and what that generates and what that does to the center, and maybe decenters that center.
After the flood, we move around to witness, acknowledge, and engage with multiple standpoints and situations.
To witness is to see, but also to engage. What do you want to do with what you see?
We're navigating, you are not landing anywhere specific. You set out into an expansive and vast space, exploring the unfamiliar, the outside.
Around keeps the space open, brings different views and ideas, perhaps not all about solutions.
Moves around that it moves forward, an oscillating line with multiple centers.
It becomes necessary, and there is one is impelled to do it by circumstance. But I still think within that moment of reaching out to the other, then there still has to be an element of will within there to want to commit to that.
But I think something we discuss and I'm interested in is how we move across spaces we are not meant to be in or where we are excluded from, and that transgressing of borders and boundaries, and coming from the outside inside and from the inside outside, and what that presents, and maybe what are, maybe a question posed is, what are some of the tactics and strategies that have been employed?
In popular memory, across conjures up, for me, it always conjures up that borderline, that kind of sense of, people who are either compelled to cross into other territory and have been displaced in some way, but also that kind of, it's both an inclination and something that is both compelling and instinctive, but also necessity.
Like for me, I just found it also interesting, the idea of a cross by leaving the position where we are in, right, to the other side, which is kind of moving towards something else and not standing or taking the stand where we what we think, what we believe in, but across to the other side of the river.
When you leave the center, when you leave the position where you stand and you go out into the world, you never return to the center as the same person.
Across the connective motion that blurs the unknown and the known.
Across prompts for us a reflection on language, a reaching across language to find meaning, to make a connection.
Diving into the known and the unknown to collectively explore connections and disconnections.
Unlearning and learning in transit, taking from this a cycle that...
To move across as an act of will, as a preparatory moment that presents a rupture opening to move through and across a threshold enclosure.
We began this, it's all through an email exchange, and we initially put a very long phrase in here, far from a phrase, actually more like streams of consciousness. But it was very much weaving around the idea of this space, in a way, a space to dream, and how that begins a journey towards something. And we were thinking, I suppose, about Beyond the Now and Tasawar as collectives, and it wove in very much to our current situations and our current preoccupations.
It started with like a conversation in writing, and for me, when I see it and how we continue each other text, so I feel that toward is the last stage of different stage that we start with, between, across, and all of this, and it's also where the vision or how sustainability can come after this word.
Okay, I think we had several points, and so our sentence is inward, toward a collective. It is imprecise, an attitude and an action, letting your attitude shape your action.
It's not about the individual, and it's not about the outcome or the product or something that kind of is associated with any one person. So it becomes something very different.
What struck me is how important it is to keep, as Aine was saying, keep those spaces open, in flux, the space in between, the uncertainty. In a world really where increasingly the invitation is to close things down, or the demand almost to close things down, and to be able to name precisely the destination. And this is something I think we need to resist.
Toward suggests a distance, maybe a horizon, but also we've been kind of coming back to a present, a now, a kind of an immediacy in the way that this has been framed here. So the distance isn't somewhere else. It's kind of it's a kind of a returning to a place of action or ideas and their relationship to action.
It was very simple, really. I think that toward always conjures up an idea of hope, and that we're moving on, we're moving toward something else. It's hope.
Towards is also an active word, so I consider this that even if we are going to close this cycle, we're going to open a new one.
Toward starts with dreaming and becomes a journey in flux, carried by flow, urgencies, and a wish for change.
We go with, we move in between, we turn around, we come across, going towards.
Utopic image of change, not yet formed. The desire and dream for change fuels the movement toward, opening up the radical act of imagining to move through the no longer and the not yet, heterotopia.
Inward toward the collective, it is imprecise, an attitude and an action, letting your attitude shape your action.
Toward is the last step, the closing of this circle.
Excellent.
I mean, I suppose what we've done today, in part, is we've explored different sets of values, and I don't like that word principles, but I can't think of another word, but ways of working, possible ways of working, thinking, and practically speaking, how might we take some of those ideas and find a way to embed them into a practice that needs to be reformed. And I think one of the practices for me that needs to be reformed is the commissioning process. We're working internationally. How might some of these values begin to shape the commissioning process when it applies to international practice?
Just the necessity of self-reflexivity and to take the time to really reflect on our positions and our practices, our processes, and things maybe we take for granted or we're just accustomed to doing.
The only point is like clarifying or defining what is the vision.
Great.
Exactly. So I think this will help us to put a plan or
Great.
so.
There's a way of taking care around our language and languages I think, which I think is an action point, and it feels like it could define the group in a way that we take care about our language and languages.
I think that before we formulate a vision, a common mission, whatever, we need really to go one step back, and each one of us to understand why is part of the collective, what can bring there, what is the real motivation. And then if we can answer all these questions, I think that we can all together formulate a vision.
I was wondering about the idea that there had been previously of including other languages spoken within the two collectives in the discussion. If that one had fallen away slightly, just as this sometimes happens, I guess, in the process of working.
I really like the kind of abstract sometimes of phrases or even poetic phrases actually out of this new ways of thinking or new ways of cooperating can emerge as well, which I found it very beautiful today. For example, with some of the phrases that was not so clear, which was beautiful, and which would talk about the blurriness between the known and the unknown, for example.
The shape of today's conversation really is not what we normally hear or engage with, particularly in terms of commissioning as well, right? So it's like, how would you absorb that invitation to do something like we did today? How would you reform the language of commissioning to absorb some of what we did today?
In Arabic, there's the word is taklif, which actually really carries a sense of responsibility. It's also the word you'd use when you hand over something to someone.
I think English does have a capacity to dream, but I think often in the international language that we use, it's very fixed. And there are other languages which take the ideas off into a whole different direction.
For me, an action in terms of keeping open this speculative space that Khaled was talking about, but I do think that there's a third move, which could be that the third season of Beyond the Now is a collaboration between Beyond the Now and Tasawar, flowing directly out of this in terms of opening up some of the questions around what those dreaming spaces, how it is that we keep those dreaming spaces open, or as Stephen said, find an alternative languaging around the commissioning process, let's say.
Ashling is as you know, Alva, is the Irish word to dream. It's a vision, but the ashling was a poetic form, and it's really interesting that you started with the political poem this morning, Caroline, because the ashling was the means through which you resisted the colonial language. So it was a vision for the future, and so it was very utopic in form.